This story begins with a man named Theo, recounting how his father, after years of hard work and a quiet retirement, brought home an African gray parrot. The bird was named Kevin, an unusual but fitting name for the lively creature that quickly became his father's companion. Theo's dad had always loved birds. He admired their intelligence and grace. He spent hours talking to Kevin, teaching him simple phrases like hello, what's up, and good. Kevin was smart, sometimes even startlingly so. He could mimic voices perfectly, and the house often echoed with his cheerful chatter. When Theo's father passed away unexpectedly, it was a devastating blow. The family was left heartbroken, and in the midst of the sorrow, there was the question of what to do with Kevin. Theo's siblings didn't want the responsibility. The bird was noisy and required attention. But Theo couldn't bear to part with the parrot. There was a sentimental connection, a feeling that Kevin was a part of his father that he couldn't let go of. So he took the bird home, settling him in the den on the lowest level of his house. It was a quiet, cozy space where Kevin seemed to adjust well. Kevin's routine was predictable. He would start chattering in the mornings and quiet down as the sun set. It became a comforting background noise for Theo, a reminder of his father's presence. For months, everything was normal. Theo grew used to the bird's company, finding solace in Kevin's familiar phrases. But one night, something unusual happened. It was close to 11 p.m., and the house was still. Theo was getting ready for bed when he heard Kevin squawking loudly, a harsh, distressed sound that echoed through the hallway. Theo frowned, his heart beating a little faster. Kevin never made noise this late at night. He left his bedroom door open and listened for a moment. The bird wasn't just repeating phrases. There was something urgent, almost frantic in the way he was calling out. "Hello, what's up, what's up?" Kevin's voice carried a sharp edge of fear. Theo rushed downstairs, his footsteps echoing in the dark. He flicked on the light in the den to find Kevin nodding his head rapidly, his feathers ruffled and eyes wide. He was making low, distressed sounds, repeating hello and what's up over and over. Theo's first thought was that the bird might be sick or hungry, so he opened the cage and offered some seeds. But Kevin ignored the food, continuing his strange, anxious behavior. "Kevin, what's wrong?" Theo asked, feeling a chill run down his spine. He reached for the cloth cover and draped it over the cage, hoping it would calm the bird. But Kevin didn't quiet down. Instead, he lowered his head and started muttering a soft, "Hello, hello." It sounded almost like a whisper. It was then that Theo heard a noise coming from the pantry. It was a faint rustling, the sound of something shifting inside. His heart pounded in his chest, and he felt a jolt of fear. The pantry door was slightly ajar, the thin strip of darkness like a mouth waiting to swallow him. He swallowed hard, feeling sweat bead on his forehead. Taking a deep breath, he stepped closer, his hand trembling as he flicked on the light. The pantry was small, crammed with shelves of food. At first, he saw nothing unusual. But then, a shadow moved. He froze, staring as the figure of a man slowly emerged, crouched low like a predator ready to spring. Theo's mind raced. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light. But then the man lunged at him, shoving past the shelves. Instinct kicked in. Theo grabbed a heavy glass jar and swung it with all his strength, hitting the man squarely in the shoulder. The intruder stumbled but didn't go down. They struggled, bodies colliding against the walls of the small room. Theo felt a surge of adrenaline, pushing the man back until he pinned him to the floor. He fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with shaky hands while keeping a knee pressed into the intruder's chest. The police arrived within minutes, pulling the man away in handcuffs. He was disheveled, mumbling nonsense, and had no identification. Theo's head was spinning as he watched the officers lead the man away. He realized with a shiver that if it weren't for Kevin's unusual behavior, he might have never known the intruder was there. As the house quieted down, Theo sat on the couch, staring at Kevin's cage. The bird had gone silent, perched calmly as if nothing had happened. Theo leaned forward, his voice breaking a little. "Thank you, Kevin," he whispered. The parrot tilted his head, looking back at him with an almost knowing gaze. Then softly, in a voice that sounded eerily like his father's, Kevin said, "Good. Good boy." Theo's breath caught in his throat. He sat back, feeling tears well up in his eyes. It was as if, for a fleeting moment, his father had been there, watching over him through the eyes of a bird. He couldn't explain it, didn't want to try. He just knew that the bond he felt was deeper than he had ever imagined. And from that night on, whenever Kevin spoke, Theo couldn't help but listen a little closer, wondering if it was just a bird or something more. A whisper from the other side, a father's love that refused to fade away. The house was always quiet when Quentin got home from school. It was his new normal. His parents had split up a few months ago, and his older brother Lyle had left for college soon after. Now it was just him and his dad most days, but with his dad working late and his own swim practices, the house felt empty, like a shell that used to be full of life. Quentin didn't mind the silence much. It gave him time to work on his essays and projects in peace. He would usually drop his bag by the door, grab a snack, and head to the basement. His office, as he liked to call it. It was a small, cluttered space filled with old furniture, cardboard boxes, and the dusty smell of things long forgotten. But it was his spot, and he found comfort in the familiar creaks of the wooden stairs and the dim light that filtered through the small basement windows. Tonight was no different. He was hunched over his laptop, typing away on an essay for history class. He could hear the soft hum of the heater, a steady noise that made the silence less heavy. Quentin was deep into his work when he heard it. A voice calling from upstairs, faint but unmistakable. "Quinny, Quinny, come up." He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was the nickname only his little brother Tevin used. But Tevin was at swim practice, wasn't he? Quentin frowned, pushing away the first flicker of unease. He figured maybe Tevin got a ride home early and didn't mention it. Without thinking too much, he called back, "Tevin? That you?" Silence. Quentin felt a chill spread down his spine. The voice had sounded exactly like Tevin's, but something about it was wrong. It had been too soft, almost muffled, like someone speaking underwater. He listened for footsteps or the usual sound of the front door slamming, but there was nothing. Just the hum of the heater and his own breathing. "Quinny, Quinny, come up," the voice called again, clearer this time. Quentin's heart raced, pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stood up, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. His unease grew, but curiosity pulled him toward the stairs. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe Tevin was playing a prank, or maybe he was imagining things after staring at his screen for too long. As he climbed the stairs, the house seemed different, like the shadows had deepened and stretched into strange shapes. He peered into the living room, his eyes scanning the familiar mess of blankets and the TV remote. But there was no sign of his brother. Quentin's mind flashed with memories, how Tevin used to jump out from behind the couch to scare him, laughing at how easily he startled. But this time, there was no laughter. The silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on him. "Tevin?" he called out, his voice smaller than he intended. It was met with more silence. Just as he turned toward the hallway, he heard the voice again, right behind him this time. "Quinny, Quinny, come up." Quentin whipped around, his breath caught in his throat. There was no one there. The air felt colder, the kind of cold that wrapped around your bones and left your skin prickling. Panic surged through him. He knew now that Tevin couldn't be here. He should still be at swim practice. Quentin's eyes darted toward the clock on the wall. It was only 6:30. Practice wouldn't be over for another hour. He stood frozen at the foot of the stairs leading up to the second floor. The darkness loomed above him, swallowing the top of the staircase in shadow. For a moment, he considered going up, but a deep sense of dread held him back. It was like every instinct in his body screamed for him to stay put. Then, the sound of the garage door rumbling open broke the silence. Quentin nearly jumped out of his skin. He turned toward the door leading to the garage just as it swung open, and his dad stepped inside. Tevin right behind him, damp hair sticking to his forehead, his swim bag slung over his shoulder. "Hey, Quinny, what's up?" Tevin said casually, dropping his bag by the door. Quentin's vision blurred and his knees buckled. He felt himself hit the floor, the shock rolling over him like a wave, leaving him cold and shivering. "What happened?" His dad's voice was sharp with concern as he rushed over. Quentin couldn't speak. He pointed weakly toward the basement stairs, his mouth dry, his heart pounding in his ears. He stared at Tevin, who looked back at him with wide, confused eyes. "I just heard you," Quentin finally managed to whisper. "You were calling me from upstairs. Just now." Tevin's expression shifted from confusion to something darker. Fear. "Quentin, I've been at practice. We just got home." The realization hit him all at once. The voice he'd heard wasn't his brother's. It couldn't have been. It wasn't possible. Quentin's dad exchanged a worried look with Tevin before helping him to his feet. They both tried to convince him it was just his imagination, maybe stress from school and the divorce. But Quentin knew what he'd heard. He could still feel the cold weight of that voice, echoing in his mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. To this day, Quentin can't explain what happened that night. He never heard the voice again. But sometimes, when he's home alone, and the house falls into its familiar silence, he swears he can feel something watching him from the shadows. And every so often, he thinks he hears it, faint and distant, calling out in that same voice. "Quinny, Quinny, come up." It was a chilly autumn evening when Breck and I found ourselves wandering down Route 209, a road mostly forgotten by the world. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only a faint purple glow in the sky. We were out for a long walk, something we did whenever we wanted to escape the stress of our dull, small-town lives. That's when we stumbled upon it, an abandoned family resort, hidden behind tall, rusted gates. The place looked like it had been left to rot for years. There were rows of small, broken-down bungalows, a large main hall with shattered windows, an old pool house covered in weeds, and a playground where the swings creaked in the breeze. It looked like a place where laughter had once echoed, now swallowed by silence and decay. "Let's check it out," Breck said, his voice crackling with excitement. I hesitated. There was something about this place that gave me an uneasy feeling, but I didn't want to seem like a coward. We both had flashlights and walkie-talkies, a habit from our teenage days of exploring abandoned buildings. We decided to split up to cover more ground, agreeing to meet back at the main hall in 20 minutes. I watched Breck disappear into the shadows of the bungalows, his flashlight beam flickering in the darkness. I headed toward the larger building, which looked like a central dining area. The door was locked tight, so I peered through a crack in the window. It was too dark to see much, just shadows and dust-covered tables. I pressed the button on the walkie-talkie. "Breck, you there?" I asked, but there was only static. I assumed he was out of range and continued exploring, moving towards an old restroom building. The moment I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. Red marks on the concrete floor. At first, I thought they were just stains from rust or paint, but as I looked closer, they resembled footprints. Not the kind left by shoes, but bare feet, smeared and dark, almost like dried blood. A chill ran down my spine. My gut told me to turn back, but before I could react, I heard a beep from the walkie-talkie. The sound came from inside the dark, open doorway of the bathroom. I stopped, frozen in place. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it towards the entrance. "Breck?" I called out, my voice echoing. No answer. Then I heard it. A faint whisper from inside. It sounded like Breck's voice, but distorted like it was underwater. "Help me," it said. I stepped back, my mind racing. Was Breck playing a prank on me? It wouldn't be the first time, but this felt different. The whisper had a strange, hollow tone. Before I could decide what to do, I heard Breck's voice again. This time, it was coming from outside, far behind me. "Don't go in there," he yelled, his voice frantic. I spun around, and there he was, running towards me, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "What are you talking about?" I shouted back, but he didn't answer. He grabbed my arm, yanking me away from the doorway. Just as we turned to leave, we heard the walkie-talkie beep again from inside the bathroom. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was laughter. A low, raspy chuckle that sounded nothing like Breck. We didn't wait to find out what it was. We ran as fast as we could, stumbling over roots and broken pavement, our flashlights bouncing wildly. The abandoned bungalows loomed around us like silent watchers. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see a shadowy figure chasing us, but there was nothing. Just that horrible, echoing laughter fading into the night. When we finally reached the main road, we stopped to catch our breath. I turned to Breck, about to ask what had happened, but the look on his face stopped me cold. "There was someone in there," he said, his voice shaking. "Inside one of the bungalows, an old woman. I thought she was a squatter at first, but then she lunged at me. Her eyes, they weren't normal. They were all black, like she had no pupils. I dropped my walkie-talkie when I ran. My blood turned to ice. But the walkie-talkie? It was inside the bathroom," I stammered. We both fell silent, the realization sinking in. There was no way Breck could have moved the walkie-talkie to the bathroom after he left it in the bungalow. And whatever we heard laughing through it wasn't human. We didn't say another word. We just walked quickly back to town, refusing to look back. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me until we were well past the outskirts, where the lights of our neighborhood came into view. To this day, we don't talk about what happened that night. We avoid Route 209 altogether. I sometimes wonder if the resort is still there, hidden behind those rusted gates, or if it's crumbled away into the earth. But one thing is certain. We weren't alone in that place. And whatever was there, it wanted us to stay. I never found a logical explanation for the red footprints, the strange laughter, or the old woman that Breck saw. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear a faint static-filled whisper echoing from the corner of my room. "Help me." The rain was coming down in thick sheets, a relentless downpour that turned the road into a blur of glistening black. I was hauling a load through the backcountry, the kind of stretch where the highways seem to swallow you whole. It was just past midnight when the call crackled through my CB radio. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. A soft, trembling voice that I barely recognized as Valen, a trucker I'd known for years. "Good Grayson," she stammered. "I need help. I'm at mile marker 94. I've been stabbed." The blood drained from my face as I yanked the wheel, my heart pounding like the roar of the engine. Valen was tough. She'd been trucking longer than I had, and she wasn't the type to spook easily. Whatever had happened, it was bad. Real bad. I floored it, the tires skidding in the wet, the darkness outside the cab feeling thicker, more oppressive. My mind raced with the countless nights we'd shared stories over the radio, swapping tales of near misses and weird encounters. But nothing like this. Nothing close. I found her pulled over, her truck barely visible through the sheets of rain. My headlights cut across her rig, and I jumped out, the cold rain soaking me instantly. When I reached her, the sight stopped me dead in my tracks. Valen was slumped against the seat, one hand clutching her side, blood seeping through her fingers. Her face was pale, and her breaths came in short, ragged gasps. "Grayson," she whispered, her eyes wide, glazed with pain and fear. "Who did this?" I demanded, feeling the ice crawl up my spine. "Hitchhiker," she croaked, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain. "I thought he was just a kid. I thought he needed help." She trailed off, shuddering. My stomach twisted as I grabbed the CB mic and called for help, my voice unsteady as I relayed the emergency. It felt like an eternity before I turned back to her, kneeling down beside the open door. I pressed my hand over hers, trying to stem the bleeding. "Stay with me, Valen. What happened? Where is he?" Her eyes darted around, wild and unfocused. "Gone," she muttered. "But his eyes, Grayson. I've never seen eyes like that. Empty, like he wasn't human." I swallowed hard, glancing out into the night. The rain beat against the asphalt, masking every sound, turning the world into a dark, wet void. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that those empty eyes were still watching from the shadows. "I saw him walking by the road," she continued, her voice frail, barely more than a whisper. "He looked harmless. Young, maybe 20, wet to the bone. I've picked up hitchhikers before, you know that. But this one..." Her voice broke and she winced, gripping her side harder. "He was quiet at first, polite even. Then, something changed. He smiled, but it wasn't right. It was like he was wearing someone else's face. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine despite the rain. I squeezed her hand tighter, trying to give her some strength. "You're gonna be okay, Valen. The ambulance is on its way." But she shook her head. "No, Grayson. Listen to me. There was something wrong with him. When he pulled the knife, it was like he became a different person. He didn't say a word, just watched me while he stabbed me. Like he was studying how I reacted." Her words sent a chill through me. I've seen my share of crazies out here, but the look on Valen's face was something I'd never forget. It wasn't just fear. It was horror. A deep, bone-chilling terror I'd never seen in her before. I glanced out at the road again, feeling exposed under the dim glow of her cab light. The rain seemed to swallow everything beyond a few feet. Whoever he was, he could be anywhere. Maybe he was watching us right now, blending into the darkness. "He left me here," she continued, her voice fading. "He didn't run. He walked away, like he knew. Like he knew I wouldn't make it." I couldn't find any words to comfort her. The rain felt colder, like it was sinking into my bones. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint wail of a siren in the distance. I kept my eyes on the road, scanning for movement, for any sign of that stranger. But there was nothing. Just the rain, the darkness, and the slick, empty highway. The ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics moving with a kind of calm urgency that told me they'd seen scenes like this too many times before. I stepped back, feeling numb as they lifted Valen onto the stretcher. Her hand slipped from mine, cold and slick with blood. "Be careful, Grayson," she whispered, her eyes locking onto mine one last time. "He's still out there." I watched as they loaded her into the ambulance, the doors slamming shut with a finality that echoed in the pit of my stomach. The red and blue lights faded into the rain-soaked night, leaving me standing alone in the dark. I never saw Valen again. She survived, but she quit trucking the day she was discharged from the hospital. She never told me more about that night, and I never asked. But I could see it in her eyes when we spoke that one last time. The fear, the lingering dread. Now every time I'm out on those long, lonely stretches of road, I can't help but glance at the shadows. I keep my doors locked tight, and I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. Because sometimes, the most dangerous things aren't the ones you can see coming. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones, the ones who smile a little too wide, who you never notice until it's too late. And out here, in the darkness, you never know who or what you might meet. I rented the cabin because I needed space. My father and I had been clashing more and more lately, and the tension was unbearable. The place was perfect for solitude. Down a dirt road, surrounded by dense trees, with only a few other cabins nearby, all vacant for the season. It was old but cozy. 2 floors, a small kitchen, a living area, and a bedroom upstairs, accessible by a narrow staircase through a hatch-like door. The first few days were uneventful. I'd come back late from my shifts at the bar, exhausted but relieved to be alone. I enjoyed the quiet. The only sounds were the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. It felt like I was finally at peace. One night, I came home after a particularly long shift. It was almost 2 a.m. I climbed up the stairs, crawled through the hatch, and collapsed onto the bed. I was drifting off when I heard it. A voice, soft and curious, calling from downstairs. "Who's up there?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was low, like someone trying not to wake the house. I bolted upright and stared at the bedroom door, waiting to hear it again. My first thought was my father. Maybe he'd driven all the way here to find me, to confront me one last time. But why would he be whispering? And how would he even get in without me hearing? I got up, walked to the window, and peered out. Nothing. Just darkness and the shapes of trees swaying in the wind. I shook it off, convincing myself it was a sound from outside, maybe a raccoon or a trick of the wind. I crawled back into bed, my pulse slowly calming down. Minutes later, there were loud, aggressive knocks on the hatch door. The sound filled the room, echoing off the walls. I didn't move, barely breathing. I couldn't convince myself it was nothing this time. The knocking was real. Someone was right below me, pounding on the door like they were desperate to get in. I stayed completely still, my back pressed against the headboard. The knock stopped, replaced by a deep, heavy silence. I realized then that my phone wasn't on the nightstand where I usually left it. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I always kept it by my side, especially at night. Slowly, I leaned over and peeked through the gap of the hatch. It was pitch black down there. I knew I had to get out. I couldn't stay in the bedroom any longer. I opened the hatch as quietly as I could, holding my breath. I slipped down the stairs, avoiding the creaky steps, and headed for the back door. I didn't even bother putting on my shoes. I just ran, barefoot, into the cold night air. I made it to the nearest cabin, pounding on the door. I could see someone inside, a man staring at me through the window. His expression was blank, almost as if he didn't understand why I was there. I kept knocking, begging him to let me in, but he didn't move. He just stared, his face pale, his eyes glassy. Something about his gaze made my skin crawl. It wasn't right. It wasn't normal. I backed away slowly, my instincts screaming that something was off. I ran back to my cabin, half expecting someone to be chasing me. My car was parked out front, and when I got in, I found my phone lying on the passenger seat. I knew I hadn't left it there. I grabbed it with trembling hands and dialed 911. "Someone's in my cabin," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Please, I need help." I waited in the car, the engine running, headlights pointed at the cabin. I stared at the house, expecting to see someone appear in the doorway, but it stayed quiet, dark. It felt like hours before the police arrived. They went inside, guns drawn, flashlights sweeping across the room. They came back out, looking puzzled. "There's no one in there," one of them said. "Are you sure you saw someone?" I nodded, trying to make sense of it. My hands were still shaking. They suggested I speak to the landlord. When I called him, he didn't sound surprised. He just sighed, like he'd been expecting this. He offered to refund part of my rent without asking any questions, like this wasn't the first time he'd dealt with a situation like this. I moved out that night. As I drove away, I glanced at the cabin one last time. The hatch door was wide open, and in the dim light, I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving inside, sitting calmly on the bed, watching the empty room. I don't know who or what was in that house, but I'm certain now that the landlord knew. And maybe the neighbor did too. They were part of something. Something that didn't care about people like me. Something that watched, waited, and kept secrets buried in those old woods. I never went back. In the quiet suburbs of Maple Grove, Celia and Ivan lived a peaceful, mundane life. The kind where neighbors exchanged pleasantries over fences, and evenings were spent in front of the television, unwinding from the day's monotony. It was late autumn, and a chill filled the night air, whispering through the bare trees outside their home. The clock had just struck 10 p.m., and Celia was settling into bed with her favorite book. Ivan, half asleep beside her, was startled awake by the sound of their landline ringing. Who could be calling at this hour? Celia wondered, raising an eyebrow. Hardly anyone used their landline anymore, and it was rare for it to ring, especially this late. Ivan reached over to answer, but as soon as he picked up the receiver, the line went dead. He frowned and shrugged it off, thinking it was just a wrong number or a technical glitch. Minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, the screen displayed unknown number. Ivan hesitated but picked up, hearing the familiar voice of their neighbor, Al. He sounded calm, almost too calm for the hour. "Hey, Ivan," Al said casually. "Do you know about the man standing outside your house?" Ivan felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced at Celia, whose face had turned pale. He walked over to the window and peered through the blinds. The street was empty, just the flicker of a distant street lamp casting eerie shadows on the sidewalk. "There's no one here, Al," Ivan said, his voice tense. "What are you talking about?" Al didn't respond. The call abruptly ended, leaving Ivan holding the silent receiver. He turned to Celia, who was now sitting up, her eyes wide with fear. "What did he say?" she whispered. Ivan tried to brush it off. "He probably meant to call someone else. Let's just go to bed." Celia didn't seem convinced, but she nodded, pulling the blankets up as if they could shield her from the unease settling over their home. Just as Ivan turned off the light, the phone rang once more. He snatched it up, feeling a wave of irritation mixed with a creeping sense of dread. It was Al again, but this time, his voice was frantic. "Ivan, you need to go outside. He's there. I swear, he's just standing there watching." The urgency in Al's tone made Ivan's skin crawl. He hung up without another word and rushed back to the window. Celia clutched his arm as they both looked out. At the end of their walkway, partially hidden by the shadows of the oak tree, stood a tall figure, dressed in a long, dark hooded coat. He was perfectly still, almost blending into the night. The figure didn't move, didn't sway in the wind. It was as if he were a statue, set there to watch. Ivan's heart pounded in his chest. He grabbed his jacket and headed towards the front door. "Ivan, no!" Celia grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading. "Just call the police." But Ivan shook his head. "If it's some prank, I'll handle it. It's probably just some kid trying to scare us." He stepped outside into the cold night air, his breath visible as he made his way down the porch steps. The figure remained motionless, not reacting to Ivan's approach. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the rustle of leaves. Ivan felt the urge to call out, but his throat was dry. "Hey!" he finally shouted. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. Just then, the phone inside the house rang again, piercing the silence. Ivan heard Celia's muffled voice answering it. A moment later, she rushed to the door, her face stricken with terror. "It's Al again," she cried. "He says he never called us tonight. He doesn't know what we're talking about." Ivan felt a wave of confusion wash over him. He looked back at the figure, but it was gone. The spot where it had stood was empty, as if it had never been there. He glanced around, but there was no trace of movement, no sound of footsteps fading into the distance. He rushed back inside, slamming the door behind him. Celia was on the phone, Al's voice faintly audible on speaker. "I swear, Ivan," Al insisted, sounding genuinely bewildered. "We've been watching a movie all night. I didn't call you. Why would I?" Ivan's hands shook as he hung up the phone. He and Celia stood there, trying to make sense of it. They decided to call Al's wife, Natalie, hoping she could confirm the story. Natalie sounded groggy, but reassured them that they hadn't made any calls. The couple sat in silence for a long while after that, their minds racing with questions they couldn't answer. Who had called them? And more terrifyingly, who or what had been standing outside their house? They tried to sleep, but every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows made them flinch. The night dragged on endlessly, filled with an unnatural tension that neither of them could shake. When the sun finally rose, casting a pale light over the neighborhood, it brought no comfort. Ivan checked outside again, but there were no footprints in the frost-covered grass, no sign anyone had been there. It was as if the figure, the calls, had been nothing more than a shared nightmare. But they knew better. The silence that followed was heavy with a new kind of fear, the kind that comes when you realize some mysteries are never meant to be solved. The landline never rang again, but they both knew. Something had been there that night, watching, waiting. And somehow it had chosen them. Neither Ivan nor Celia ever felt truly alone in their home again. Cousins Arlo and Jace had been planning this camping trip for months. They chose Urau Forest in Colorado, a remote stretch of wilderness that Jace, a seasoned Eagle Scout, swore would offer peace and quiet. Midweek, the forest would be empty. No other campers, no noise, just the rustle of the trees and the sound of a crackling fire. It was perfect, or so they thought. The drive up was filled with laughter, old stories, and the excitement of being away from the city. Arlo wasn't as experienced as Jace, but he trusted his cousin. Jace knew how to build a campfire, navigate by the stars, and identify tracks. By the time they arrived, the sun was sinking, casting long shadows through the dense canopy. They quickly set up their tents and got a fire going. Dinner was simple but satisfying. Steaks sizzling on the flames, followed by juicy burgers. The forest was calm, the only sound the occasional owl hooting in the distance. But then, they heard it. At first it was faint, almost drowned out by the crackle of the fire. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching leaves underfoot. Arlo glanced at Jace, expecting his cousin to dismiss it as an animal, but Jace's face was tense, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft humming, a tune neither of them recognized. It was a lullaby, eerie and out of place in the silence of the forest. Jace stood up, peering into the darkness. "Hello?" he called out. His voice was strong, but Arlo could hear the edge of fear. There was no answer, only the sound of retreating footsteps. They exchanged a look, both trying to laugh it off, but the unease lingered like a bad taste. They decided not to move camp. It was too risky to navigate the woods in the dark. Jace kept the bear spray within reach, and Arlo gripped his flashlight tightly. The night stretched on. Arlo couldn't sleep. Every rustle of leaves seemed amplified. Around midnight, the humming returned, this time closer. It was softer now, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. Then came a thud, a stick landing in the middle of their campsite. Arlo's heart raced, his hands shaking as he pointed the flashlight into the woods. He saw nothing but darkness. Jace shot up, his face pale but determined. "Who's out there?" he yelled. Silence. Then, faint footsteps moving away quickly. Whoever, or whatever, it was, they weren't alone. The sounds seemed to come from different directions, like a group circling them, watching, waiting. Arlo's skin prickled with cold fear, the realization sinking in that this wasn't some animal wandering by. They were being hunted. Jace tried to keep up their spirits, cracking jokes about city folk spooking easily, but his laughter was forced. They agreed to take turns sleeping. Jace took the first shift, leaving Arlo to rest. But rest didn't come easy. Arlo drifted in and out of sleep, his dreams filled with shadowy figures standing just outside the tent. A sudden noise jolted Arlo awake. He opened his eyes, disoriented, the pale light of dawn just beginning to seep through the fabric of the tent. There was a face, right there, peering in through the small mesh window. Arlo blinked, confused, thinking it was Jace. The face was pale, eyes wide and unblinking. It took a moment for Arlo to realize. The face was wrong. The eyes were too large, the mouth twisted into a strange smile. Arlo's breath caught in his throat. He whipped his head around, only to see Jace still asleep in his own tent, snoring softly. A wave of cold dread washed over him as the realization hit. Whoever was looking into his tent wasn't Jace. He scrambled backwards, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying it was just his imagination. When he opened them again, the face was gone. "Jace!" Arlo hissed, his voice trembling. He unzipped his tent and crawled out, stumbling over to his cousin's tent. He shook Jace awake. "We have to go, now!" Jace blinked at him, confused, then saw the look on Arlo's face. He didn't ask questions. They packed up in a frenzy, not bothering to fold the tents properly, stuffing everything into their bags. The humming started up again, faint but unmistakable, followed by laughter, high-pitched and distorted, echoing through the trees. They ran. The forest felt like it was closing in on them, the trees towering, the path twisting and turning, like it was trying to trap them. Neither of them spoke. They just sprinted, adrenaline pushing them forward. The sun was fully up by the time they reached the car, their chests heaving, sweat pouring down their faces. They threw their bags in and peeled out of the dirt road, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. They didn't stop driving until they hit the highway. Arlo was shaking, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Jace was silent, staring straight ahead, his face ashen. "What was that?" Arlo finally managed to whisper. Jace didn't answer. He didn't need to. The fear in his eyes told Arlo everything he needed to know. They had seen something, or someone, in the forest. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. Arlo hasn't gone camping since. The memories of that night still haunt him. The image of that face burned into his mind. He tries to forget, but every so often, when he's alone and it's too quiet, he swears he can still hear that humming, drifting through the air like a twisted lullaby. It was a perfect summer weekend when a group of friends decided to rent a beach house in Florida. The house sat quietly between the bay and the ocean, offering a stunning view of both. The sound of waves crashing against the shore was soothing, and the sun was setting with a golden glow that promised a night of laughter and memories. Kai, Lila, Mason, and Viv were ecstatic. They had been planning this trip for months, eager to escape their mundane routines and immerse themselves in the beauty of the beach. The first day went exactly as planned. They spent hours on the beach, swimming, playing football, and sipping on cold beers. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and purple. It was a peaceful moment, the kind they'd all hoped for. As night fell, they decided to take their game back to the beach under the moonlight. It was late, and the beach was empty, giving them a sense of freedom. But as Mason kicked the football towards the water, they noticed someone standing waist-deep in the ocean. The moonlight outlined the figure against the dark water. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was standing still, too still, as if the waves had no effect on him. Lila squinted her eyes, trying to make out his face, but it was shadowed. Must be a local enjoying a midnight swim. Kai shrugged, dismissing the odd feeling in the pit of his stomach. They returned to their game, laughing and trying to shake off the strange sight. After a while, they started walking back to the house, but Mason turned back for a final glance. The figure was no longer in the water. Instead, he was standing on the shore, far away yet facing them directly. A chill ran down Mason's spine. "Hey, do you see that?" he whispered, pointing. The others turned, their eyes following his finger. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't even acknowledge their presence. He just stood there, watching them. "Let's go inside," Viv suggested, her voice wavering slightly. The unease was spreading among them now, a dark cloud overshadowing their laughter from earlier. They locked the sliding door behind them and settled on the couches, trying to shake off the weirdness of the moment. They joked about it, saying it was probably some drunk local or a prankster. But deep down, each of them felt something was off. Later that night, as the others drifted off to sleep, Kai couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. He got up to grab a glass of water and paused by the deck window. There, standing just a few feet away on the sand, was the same figure. He was closer now, close enough that Kai could almost make out his face, but it was hidden in the shadows. He felt his heart slam against his chest. He rushed to wake Mason. "There's someone outside staring at the house." Mason groggily followed him to the window, but the figure was gone. They scanned the beach, the deck, but there was nothing there. "Are you sure, Kai?" Mason asked, rubbing his eyes. Kai nodded, but he could see the doubt in Mason's expression. They both went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Around 3 a.m., a loud, deliberate knock came from the window of the bedroom. It was a single, solid knock that seemed to echo through the entire house. Viv and Lila woke up, startled, and the four of them gathered together, whispering frantically. Mason grabbed a flashlight, and they all tiptoed to the window. There was nothing outside but the moonlit beach. No footprints, no sign of anyone. "This isn't funny anymore," Lila said, her voice breaking. The next morning, they couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. They decided to ask a neighbor about the strange figure. An elderly man in the next house over looked at them with wide eyes when they described what happened. "You saw him too?" he whispered. "Last week, someone knocked on my door in the middle of the night. When I looked through the peephole, there was a man standing there staring straight ahead. I asked him what he wanted, but he didn't answer. Just stood there like he was waiting for something." Viv felt her blood run cold. "Did he leave?" The man nodded slowly. "Eventually. But it was like he just disappeared into the darkness. No footsteps, no sound. I've never seen anything like it before." By noon, the friends had packed their bags, not bothering to enjoy the beach one last time. The house that had once felt like a dream now felt like a trap. As they loaded up the car, Kai turned back for a final glance. For a split second, he thought he saw a shadow standing in the window of the house, looking back at him. He blinked, and it was gone. They drove away in silence. The laughter from the first day a distant memory, replaced by a deep, unsettling fear they couldn't quite name. They never spoke about the figure again, but each of them knew they'd never forget those eyes, or the way he seemed to watch them from the shadows like he was still waiting for something.